Section 4 of The Faith of Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian Ackerman. Too Much Gold by Jack London. This being a story, and a truer one than it may appear, of a mining country, it is quite to be expected that it will be a hard luck story. But that depends on the point of view. Hard luck is a mild way of terming it, so far as Kink Mitchell and Hootchinoo Bill are concerned, and that they have a decided opinion in the subject is a matter of common knowledge in the Yukon country. It was in the fall of 1896 that the two partners came down to the east bank of the Yukon and drew a Peterborough canoe from a moss-covered cache. They were not particularly pleasant-looking objects. A summer's prospecting, filled to repletion with hardship and rather empty of grub, had left their clothes in tatters, and themselves worn and cadaverous. A nimbus of mosquitoes buzzed about each man's head. Their faces were coated with blue clay. Each carried a lump of this damp clay, and whenever it dried and fell from their faces, more was daubed on in its place. There was a querulous plaint in their voices, an irritability of movement and gesture that told of broken sleep and a losing struggle with the little winged pests. "Them skeeters'll be the death of me yet," Kink Mitchell whimpered, as the canoe felt the current on her nose, and leapt out from the bank. Cheer up, we're about done," Hootchinoo Bill answered, with an attempted heartiness in his funereal tones that was ghastly. "We'll be in 40 Mile in 40 minutes, and then, cursed little devil!" One hand left his paddle and landed on the back of his neck with a sharp slap. He put a fresh daub of clay on the injured part, swearing sulphurously the while. Kink Mitchell was not the least amused. He merely improved the opportunity by putting a thicker coating of clay on his own neck. They crossed the Yukon to its west bank, shot downstream with easy stroke, and at the end of 40 minutes swung in close to the left around the tail of an island. 40 Mile spread itself suddenly before them. Both men straightened their backs and gazed at the sight. They gazed long and carefully, drifting with the current, in their faces an expression of mingled surprise and consternation slowly gathering. Not a thread of smoke was rising from the hundreds of log cabins. There was no sound of axes biting sharply into wood, of hammering and sawing. Neither dogs nor men loitered before the big wood store. No steamboats lay at the bank, no canoes, nor scows, nor poling boats. The river was as bare of craft as the town was of life. "Kinda looks like Gabriel's tooted his little horn, and you and me is turned up missin'," remarked Hootchinoo Bill. His remark was casual, as though there was nothing unusual about the occurrence. Kink Mitchell's reply was just as casual, as though he, too, were unaware of any strange perturbation of spirit. "Looks as though they were all Baptists, then, and took the boats to go by water," was his conclusion. "My old dad was a Baptist," Hootchinoo Bill supplemented, "and he always did hold it was 40,000 miles nearer that way." This was the end of their levity. They ran the canoe in and climbed the high earth bank. A feeling of awe descended upon them as they walked the deserted streets. The sunlight streamed placidly over the town. A gentle wind tapped the halyards against the flagpole before the closed doors of the Caledonia dance hall. Mosquitoes buzzed, robins sang, and the moose birds tripped hungrily among the cabins. But there was no human life, nor sign of human life. "I'm just dyin' for a drink," Hootchinoo Bill said, and unconsciously his voice sank to a hoarse whisper. His partner nodded his head, loath to hear his own voice break the stillness. They trudged on in uneasy silence till surprised by an open door. Above this door, and stretching the width of the building, a rude sign announced the same as the Monte Carlo. But beside the door, hat over eyes, chair tilted back, a man sat sunning himself. He was an old man. Beard and hair were long and white and patriarchal. "If it ain't old Jim Cummins turned up like us too late for resurrection," said Kink Mitchell. "Most like he didn't hear Gabriel tootin'," was Hootchinoo Bill's suggestion. "Hello, Jim! Wake up!" he shouted. The old man unlimbered lamely, blinking his eyes and murmuring automatically, "What'll ye have, gents? What'll ye have?" They followed him inside, and ranged up against the long bar where of yore half a dozen nimble barkeepers found little time to loaf. The great room, ordinarily aroar with life, was still and gloomy as a tomb. There was no rattling of chips, no whirring of ivory balls. Roulette and faro tables were like gravestones under their canvas covers. No women's voices drifted merrily from the dance room behind. Old Jim Cummings wiped a glass with palsied hands, and Kink Mitchell scrawled his initials on the dust-covered bar. "Where's the girls?" Hootchinoo Bill shouted with affected geniality. "Gone," was the ancient barkeeper's reply, in a voice thin and aged as himself, and as unsteady as his hand. "Where's Bidwell and Barlow?" "Gone." "And Sweetwater Charlie?" "Gone." "And his sister too?" "Gone too." "Your daughter Sally, then, and her little kid?" "Gone, all gone." The old man shook his head sadly, rummaging in an absent way among the dusty bottles. "Great Sardanapalus! Where?" Kink Mitchell exploded, unable longer to restrain himself. "You don't say you've had the plague?" "Why, ain't you heerd?" The old man chuckled quietly. "They all's gone to Dawson." "What like is that?" Bill demanded. "A creek, or a bar, or a place?" "Ain't never heerd of Dawson, eh?" The old man chuckled exasperatingly. "Why, Dawson's a town, a city, bigger'n 40 Mile. Yes, sir, bigger'n 40 Mile. "I've been in this land 7 year," Bill announced emphatically, "and I make free to say I never heard tell of that burg before. Hold on, let's have some more of that whiskey. Your information's flabbergasted me, that it has. Now just whereabouts is this Dawson place you was a-mentionin'?" "On the big flat just below the mouth of the Klondike," old Jim answered. "But where has you all been this summer?" "Never mind where we all's been," was Kink Mitchell's testy reply. "We all's been where the skeeters is that thick you got to throw a stick into the air so as to see the sun and tell the time of day. Ain't I right, Bill?" "Right you are," said Bill. "But speaking of this Dawson place, how like did it happen to be, Jim?" "Ounce to the pan on a creek called Bonanza, and they ain't got to bedrock yet." "Who struck it?" "Carmack." At mention of the discoverer's name the partners stared at each other disgustedly. Then they winked with great solemnity. "Siwash George," sniffed Hootchinoo Bill. "That squaw man," sneered Kink Mitchell. "I wouldn't put on my moccasins to stampede after anything he'd ever find," said Bill. "Same here," announced his partner. "A cuss that's too plumb lazy to fish his own salmon. That's why he took up with the Indians. S'pose that black brother-in-law of his, let me see, Skookum Jim, eh? S'pose he's in on it?" The old barkeeper nodded. "Sure. And what's more, all 40 Mile, exceptin' me and a few cripples." "And drunks," added Kink Mitchell. "No, sir—ee!" the old man shouted emphatically. "I bet you the drinks Hawkins ain't in on it," Hootchinoo Bill cried with certitude. Old Jim's face lighted up. "I takes you, Bill, and you loses." "However did that old soak budge out of 40 Mile?" Mitchell demanded. "They ties him down and throws him the bottom of a polin' boat," old Jim explained. "Come right in here, they did, and takes him out of that there chair there in the corner, and 3 more drunks they find under the piany. I tell you alls, the whole camp hits the Yukon for Dawson just like Sam Scratch was after them. Women, children, babes in arms, the whole shebang. Bidwell comes to me and says he, 'Jim, I wants you to keep tab on the Monte Carlo. I'm going.' 'Where's Barlow?' says I. 'Gone,' says he, 'and I'm a-followin' with a load of whiskey.' And with that, never waitin' for me to decline, he makes a run for his boat, and away he goes, polin' up river like mad. So here I be, and these is the first drinks I've passed out in 3 days." The partners looked at each other. "Gosh darn my buttons," said Hootchinoo Bill. "Seems like you and me, Kink, is the kind of folks always caught out with forks when it rains soup." "Wouldn't it take the saleratus out of your dough now," said Kink. "A stampede of tin horns, drunks, and loafers." "And squawmen," added Bill. "Not a genuine miner in the whole caboodle. Genuine miners, like you and me, Kink," he went on academically, "is all out and sweatin' hard over Birch Creek way. Not a genuine miner in this whole crazy Dawson outfit, and I say right here, not a step do I budge for any Carmack strike. I've got to see the color of the dust first." "Same here," Mitchell agreed. "Let's have another drink." Having wet this resolution, they beached the canoe, transferred its contents to the cabin, and cooked dinner. But as the afternoon wore along, they grew restive. They were men used to the silence of the great wilderness, but this grave-like silence of a town worried them. They caught themselves listening for familiar sounds, waitin' for something to make a noise which ain't goin' to make a noise, as Bill put it. They strolled through the deserted streets to the Monte Carlo for more drinks, and wandered along the river bank to the steamer landing, where only water gurgled as the eddy filled and emptied, and an occasional salmon leapt flashing into the sun. They sat down in the shade in front of the store and talked with the consumptive storekeeper, whose liability to hemorrhage accounted for his presence. Bill and Kink told him how they intended loafing in their cabin and resting up after the hard summer's work. They told him, with a certain insistence that was half appeal for belief, half challenge for contradiction, how much they were going to enjoy their idleness, but the storekeeper was uninterested. He switched the conversation back to the strike on Klondike, and they could not keep him away from it. He could think of nothing else, talk of nothing else, till Hootchinoo Bill rose up in anger and disgust. "Gosh darn Dawson, I say!" "Same here," said Kink Mitchell, with brightening face. "One'd think something was doing up there, 'stead of being a mere stampede of greenhorns and tinhorns." But a boat came into view from downstream. It was long and slim. It hugged the bank closely, and its 3 occupants, standing upright, propelled it against the stiff current by means of long poles. "Circle City outfit," said the storekeeper. "I was looking for 'em along by afternoon. 40 Mile had the start of them by 170 miles. But gee, they ain't losing any time." "We'll just sit here quiet-like and watch 'em string by," Bill said complacently. As he spoke, another boat appeared in sight, followed after a brief interval by 2 others. By this time the first boat was abreast of the men on the bank. Its occupants did not cease poling while greetings were exchanged, and, though its progress was slow, a half-hour saw it out of sight up the river. Still they came from below, boat after boat, in endless procession. The uneasiness of Bill and Kink increased. They stole speculative, tentative glances at each other, and when their eyes met, looked away in embarrassment. Finally, however, their eyes met, and neither looked away. Kink opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him, and his mouth remained open while he continued to gaze at his partner. "Just what I was thinking, Kink," said Bill. They grinned sheepishly at each other, and by tacit consent started to walk away. Their pace quickened, and by the time they arrived at their cabin they were on the run. "Can't lose no time with all that multitude a-rushin' by," Kink spluttered, as he jabbed the sourdough can into the bean pot with one hand and with the other gathered in the frying pan and coffee pot. "Should say not," gasped Bill, his head and shoulders buried in a clothes sack, wherein were stored winter socks and underwear. "I say, Kink, don't forget the saleratus on the corner shelf back of the stove." Half an hour later they were launching the canoe and loading up, while the storekeeper made jocular remarks about poor weak mortals and the contagiousness of stampedin' fever. But when Bill and Kink thrust their long poles to the bottom and started the canoe against the current, he called after them, "Well, so long and good luck, and don't forget to blaze a steak or 2 for me." They nodded their heads vigorously, and felt sorry for the poor wretch who remained perforce behind. Kink and Bill were sweating hard. According to the Revised Northland Scripture, the stampede is to the swift, the blazing of steaks to the strong, and the crown in royalties gathers to itself the fullness thereof. Kink and Bill were both swift and strong. They took the soggy trail at a long, swinging gait that broke the hearts of a couple of tenderfeet who tried to keep up with them. Behind, strung out between them and Dawson, where the boats were discarded and land travel began, was the vanguard of the Circle City outfit. In the race from 40 Mile, the partners had passed every boat, winning from the leading boat by a length in the Dawson eddy, and leaving its occupant sadly behind the moment their feet struck the trail. "Huh! Couldn't see us for smoke," Hootchinoo Bill chuckled, flirting the stinging sweat from his brow and glancing swiftly back along the way they had come. 3 men emerged from where the trail broke through the trees. 2 followed close at their heels, and then a man and woman shot into view. "Come on, you Kink! Hit her up! Hit her up!" Bill quickened his pace. Mitchell glanced back in more leisurely fashion. "I declare if they ain't lopin'! And here's one that's loped himself out," said Bill, pointing to the side of the trail. A man was lying on his back, panting, in the culminating stages of violent exhaustion. His face was ghastly, his eyes bloodshot and glazed, for all the world like a dying man. "Chechaquo," Kink Mitchell grunted, and it was the grunt of the old sourdough for the greenhorn, for the man who outfitted with self-risin flour and used baking powder in his biscuits. The partners, true to the old-timer custom, had intended to stake downstream from the strike, but when they saw claim 81 below blazed on a tree, which meant fully 8 miles below Discovery, they changed their minds. The 8 miles were covered in less than 2 hours. It was a killing pace over so rough trail, and they passed scores of exhausted men that had fallen by the wayside. At Discovery little was to be learned of the upper creek. Cormac's Indian brother-in-law, Skookum Jim, had a hazy notion that the creek was staked as high as the 30s, but when Kink and Bill looked at the corner stakes of 79 above, they threw their stampeding packs off their backs and sat down to smoke. All their efforts had been in vain. Bonanza was staked from mouth to source. Out of sight and across the next divide, Bill complained that night as they fried their bacon and boiled their coffee over Cormac's fire at Discovery. "Try that pup," Carmack suggested next morning. That pup was a broad creek that flowed into Bonanza at 7 above. The partners received his advice with the magnificent contempt of the sourdough for a squaw man, and, instead, spent a day on Adams Creek, another and more likely-looking tributary of Bonanza. But it was the old story over again, staked to the skyline. For 3 days Carmack repeated his advice, and for 3 days they received it contemptuously. But on the 4th day, there being nowhere else to go, they went up that pup. They knew that it was practically unstaked, but they had no intention of staking. The trip was made more for the purpose of giving vent to their ill humor than for anything else. They had become quite cynical, skeptical. They jeered and scoffed at everything, and insulted every Chechaquo they met along the way. At number 23, the stakes ceased. The remainder of the creek was open for location. "Moose pasture," sneered Kink Mitchell. But Bill gravely paced off 500 feet up the creek and blazed the corner stakes. He had picked up the bottom of a candle box, and on the smooth side he wrote the notice for his center stake. "This moose pasture is reserved for the Swedes and Chechaquos. Bill Rader." Kink read it over with approval, saying, "As them's my sentiments, I reckon I might as well subscribe." So the name of Charles Mitchell was added to the notice, and many an old sourdough's face relaxed that day at the sight of the handiwork of a kindred spirit. "How's the pup?" Carmack inquired when they strolled back into camp. "To hell with pups," was Hootchinoo Bill's reply. "Me and Kink's goin' a-lookin' for Too Much Gold when we get rested up." Too Much Gold was the fabled creek of which all sourdoughs dreamed, whereof it was said the gold was so thick that in order to wash it, gravel must first be shoveled into the sluice boxes. But the several days' rest, preliminary to the quest for Too Much Gold, brought a slight change in their plan, inasmuch as it brought one Ans Henderson, a Swede. Ans Henderson had been working for wages all summer at Miller Creek, over on the 60 Mile, and, the summer done, had strayed up Bonanza like many another waif helplessly adrift on the gold tides that swept willy-nilly across the land. He was tall and lanky. His arms were long, like prehistoric man's. His hands were like soup plates, twisted and gnarled, and big-knuckled from toil. He was slow of utterance and movement, and his eyes, pale blue as his hair was pale yellow, seemed filled with an immortal dreaming, the stuff of which no man knew, and himself least of all. Perhaps this appearance of immortal dreaming was due to a supreme and vacuous innocence. At any rate, this was the valuation men of ordinary clay put upon him, and there was nothing extraordinary about the composition of Hootchinoo Bill and Kink Mitchell. The partners had spent a day of visiting and gossip, and in the evening met in the temporary quarters of the Monte Carlo, a large tent where stampeders rested their weary bones and bad whiskey sold at $1 a drink. Since the only money in circulation was dust, and since the house took the down weight on the scales, a drink cost something more than $1. Bill and Kink were not drinking, principally for the reason that their one and common sack was not strong enough to stand many excursions to the scales. "Say, Bill, I've got a Chechaquo on the string for a sack of flour," Mitchell announced jubilantly. Bill looked interested and pleased. Grub was scarce, and they were not over-plentifully supplied for the quest after Too Much Gold. "Flour's worth $1 a pound," he answered. "How like do you calculate to get your finger on it?" "Trade 'em a half interest in that claim of ourn," Kink answered. "What claim?" Bill was surprised. Then he remembered the reservation he had staked off for the Swedes, and said, "Oh, I wouldn't be so close about it, though," he added. "Give him the whole thing while you're about it, and in a right free-handed way." Bill shook his head. "If I did, he'd get clean scairt and prance off. I'm lettin' on as how the ground is believed to be valuable, and that we're lettin' go just because we're monstrous short on grub. After the dicker we can make him a present of the whole shebang." "If someone ain't disregarded our notice," Bill objected, though he was plainly pleased at the prospect of exchanging the claim for a sack of flour. "She ain't jumped," Kink assured him. "It's number 24, and it stands. The Chechaquos took it serious, and they've begun staking where you left off. Staked clean over the divide, too. I was gassin' with one of them which had just got in with cramps in his legs." It was then, and for the first time, that they heard the slow and groping utterance of Ans Handerson. "I like the looks," he was saying to the barkeeper. "I tank I got a claim." The partners winked at each other, and a few minutes later a surprised and grateful Swede was drinking bad whiskey with two hard-hearted strangers. But he was as hard-headed as they were hard-hearted. The sack made frequent journeys to the scales, followed solicitously each time by Kink Mitchell's eyes, and still Ans Handerson did not loosen up. In his pale blue eyes, as in summer seas, immortal dreams swam up and burned. But the swimming and the burning were due to the tales of gold and prospect pans he heard, rather than to the whiskey he slid so easily down his throat. The partners were in despair, though they appeared boisterous and jovial of speech and action. "Don't mind me, my friend," Hootchinoo Bill hiccuped, his hand upon Ans Handerson's shoulder. "Have another drink. We're just celebratin' Kink's birthday here. This is my pardner, Kink Mitchell. And what might your name be?" This learned, his hand descended resoundingly on Kink's back, and Kink simulated clumsy self-consciousness in that he was for the time being the center of the rejoicing, while Ans Handerson looked pleased and asked them to have a drink with him. It was the first and last time he treated, until the play changed and his canny soul was roused to unwonted prodigality. But he paid for the liquor from a fairly healthy-looking sack. Not less than 800 in it, calculated the lynx-eyed Kink, and on the strength of it he took the first opportunity of a privy conversation with Bidwell, the proprietor of the bad whiskey in the tent. "Here's my sack, Bidwell," Kink said, with the intimacy and surety of one old-timer to another. "Just weigh $50 into it for a day or so, more or less, and we'll be yours truly, Bill and me." Thereafter the journeys of the sack to the scales were more frequent, and the celebration of Kink's natal day waxed hilarious. He even essayed to sing the old-timers' classic, "The Juice of the Forbidden Fruit," but broke down and drowned his embarrassment in another round of drinks. Even Bidwell honored him with a round or two on the house, and he and Bill were decently drunk by the time Ans Handerson's eyelids began to droop and his tongue gave promise of loosening. Bill grew affectionate, then confidential. He told his troubles and hard luck to the barkeeper and the world in general, and to Ans Handerson in particular. He required no histrionic powers to act the part. The bad whiskey attended to that. He worked himself into great sorrow for himself and Bill, and his tears were sincere when he told how he and his partner were thinking of selling a half interest in good ground just because they were short of grub. Even Kink listened and believed. Ans Handerson's eyes were shining unholily as he asked, "How much you think you take?" Bill and Kink did not hear him, and he was compelled to repeat his query. They appeared reluctant. He grew keener, and he swayed back and forward, holding on to the bar, and listened with all his ears while they conferred together on one side, and wrangled as to whether they should or not, and disagreed in stage whispers over the price they should set. "$250," Bill finally announced, "but we reckon as we won't sell." "Which is monstrous wise, if I might chip in my little say," seconded Bidwell. "Yes, indeedy," added Kink. "We ain't in no charity business, and a disgorgin' free and generous to Swedes and white men." "I tank we have another drink," hiccuped Ans Handerson, craftily changing the subject against a more propitious time. And thereafter, to bring about that propitious time, his own sack began to seesaw between his hip pocket and the scales. Bill and Kink were coy, but they finally yielded to his blandishments, whereupon he grew shy and drew Bidwell to one side. He staggered exceedingly, and held on to Bidwell for support as he asked, "They ban all right, them men, you tank so?" "Sure," Bidwell answered heartily. "Known 'em for years. Old sourdoughs. When they sell a claim, they sell a claim. They ain't no air dealers." "I tank I buy," Ans Handerson announced, tottering back to the two men. But by now he was dreaming deeply, and he proclaimed that he would have the whole claim or nothing. This was the cause of great pain to Hootchinoo Bill. He orated grandly against the hoggishness of Chechaquos and Swedes, albeit he dozed between periods, his great voice dying away to a gurgle, and his head sinking forward on his breast. But whenever roused by a nudge from Kink or Bidwell, he never failed to explode another volley of abuse and insult. Ans Handerson was calm under it all. Each insult added to the value of the claim. Such unamiable reluctance to sell advertised but one thing to him, and he was aware of a great relief when Hootchinoo Bill sank snoring to the floor, and he was free to turn his attention to the less intractable partner. Kink Mitchell was persuadable, though a poor mathematician. He wept dolefully, but was willing to sell a half interest for $250, or the whole claim for $750. Ans Handerson and Bidwell labored to clear away his erroneous ideas concerning fractions, but their labor was vain. He spilled tears and regrets all over the bar and on their shoulders, which tears, however, did not wash away his opinion that if one half was worth $250, two halves were worth 3 times as much. In the end, and even Bidwell retained no more than hazy recollections of how the night terminated, a bill of sale was drawn up, wherein Bill Rader and Charles Mitchell yielded up all right and title to the claim known as 24 El Dorado, the same being the name the creek had received from some optimistic Chechaquo. When Kink had signed, it took the united efforts of the three to arouse Bill. Pen in hand, he swayed long over the document, and each time he rocked back and forth, in Ans Handerson's eyes flashed and faded a wondrous golden vision. When the precious signature was at last appended, and the dust paid over, he breathed a great sigh, and sank to sleep under a table, where he dreamed immortally until morning. But the day was chill and gray. He felt bad. His first act, unconscious and automatic, was to feel for his sack. Its lightness startled him. Then, slowly, memories of the night thronged into his brain. Rough voices disturbed him. He opened his eyes and peered out from under the table. A couple of early risers, or rather men who had been out on trail all night, were vociferating their opinions concerning the utter and loathsome worthlessness of El Dorado Creek. He grew frightened, felt in his pocket, and found the deed to 24 El Dorado. 10 minutes later, Hootchinoo Bill and Kink Mitchell were roused from their blankets by a wild-eyed Swede that strove to force upon them an ink-scrawled and very blotty piece of paper. "I tank I take my money back," he gibbered. "I tank I take my money back." Tears were in his eyes and throat. They ran down his cheeks as he knelt before them and pleaded and implored. But Bill and Kink did not laugh. They might have been harder-hearted. "First time I ever met a man squeal over a minin' deal," Bill said, "and I make free to say 'tis too unusual for me to savvy." "Same here," Kink Mitchell remarked. "Minin' deals is like horse trading." They were honest in their wonderment. They could not conceive of themselves raising a wail over a business transaction, so they could not understand it in another man. "The poor ornery Chechaquo," murmured Hootchinoo Bill, as they watched the sorrowing Swede disappear up the trail. "But this ain't too much gold," Kink Mitchell said cheerfully. And ere the day was out, they purchased flour and bacon at exorbitant prices with Ans Handerson's dust, and crossed over the divide in the direction of the creeks that lie between the Klondike and Indian River. 3 months later they came back to the divide, in the midst of a snowstorm, and dropped down the trail to 24 El Dorado. It merely chanced that the trail led them that way. They were not looking for the claim, nor could they see much through the driving white till they set foot upon the claim itself. And then the air lightened, and they beheld a dump, capped by a windlass that a man was turning. They saw him draw a bucket of gravel from the hole and tilt it on the edge of the dump. Likewise they saw another man, strangely familiar, filling a pan with the fresh gravel. His hands were large, his hair Wet's pale yellow. But before they reached him, he turned with the pan and fled toward a cabin. He wore no hat, and the snow falling down his neck accounted for his haste. Bill and Kink ran after him, and came upon him in the cabin, kneeling by the stove and washing the pan of gravel in a tub of water. He was too deeply engaged to notice more than that somebody had entered the cabin. They stood at his shoulder and looked on. He imparted to the pan a deft circular motion, pausing once or twice to rake out the larger particles of gravel with his fingers. The water was muddy, and with the pan buried in it they could see nothing of its contents. Suddenly he lifted the pan clear and sent the water out of it with a flirt. A mass of yellow, like butter in churn, showed across the bottom. Hootchinoo Bill swallowed. Never in his life had he dreamed of so rich a test pan. "Kind of thick, my friend," he said huskily. "How much might you reckon that all to be?" Ans Handerson did not look up as he replied, "I tank 50 ounces." "You must be scrumptious rich, then, eh?" Still Ans Handerson kept his head down, absorbed in putting in the fine touches which wash out the last particles of dross, though he answered, "I tank I been wort $500,000." "Gosh!" said Hootchinoo Bill, and he said it reverently. "Yes, Bill, gosh!" said Kink Mitchell, and they went out softly and closed the door. End of Too Much Gold. Recording by Brian Ackerman.